Chapter 12, Antebellum Culture and Reform. We are from a time frame of 1821 to 1855. The Romantic Pulse, the spirit of Romanticism. In the four quarters of the globe, wrote the English writer Sidney Smith in 1820, who reads, goes to an American play, or looks at an American statue or picture. The American intellectuals were painfully aware of the low regard in which the Europeans held their culture. They tried to create an altruistic life that would express their own nation's special virtues. At the same time, the national culture leaders were striving for another kind of liberation, which was ironically largely an import from Europe. The spirit of Romanticism, philosophy, art, politics, and economics, and the committed spirit of America. Nationalism and Romanticism in American paintings. The Hudson School. Hudson River School emerged in New York. Frederick Church, Tom Cole, Tom Dowdery, Ashley Durard, and other painters with spectacular vistas of rugged and still largely untamed Hudson Valley. Like Randolph Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, whom many of the painters read and admired, were considered nature far more than civilization. They made everything about what was going on in the wild of the Americas. Lots of pictures of nature areas and landscapes. James Fenimore Cooper was a first great novelist, and about American West. Cooper had a lifelong fascination with human relationships, to nature, and the challenges of American life, and expansion westward. His most important novels were The Last of the Mohicans and The Deerslayer. Examined the experience of the rugged white frontiersmen, of the Indians, pioneers, violence, and the law. Cooper invoked the idea of independent individualism with natural inner goodness. Walt Whitman, he wrote the book Leaves of Grass in 1855, which celebrated democracy. He believed in the spirit of pleasure of the flesh, helping free verse from traditional and restrictive conventions, physical release and personal fulfillment. Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick in 1851. That was his most important book. It tells the story of Ahab, the powerful divide captain of the whaling vessel, which he was in search of the great whale, Moby Dick. Literature in the antebellum South, Edgar Allan Poe. There are some fabulous people that can do Edgar Allan Poe stories of his poems that are just breathtaking when you hear them, and there's always that chill with Edgar Allan that comes in. The Raven is his most famous in 1845. Poe invokes images of individuals raising above the narrow confines of intellect and exploring deeper, often painful, horrifying spirits and emotions. Gilmore Simms was distinguished men of letters. For a time, his work expressed broad nationalism and transcended his religious background. By 1840, he too became a strong defender of Southern institutions, especially slavery, against the encroachment of the North. There he believed the unique quality of the Southern life fell to intellectuals to defend. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a transcendentalist philosopher who emerged in America among a small group of intellectuals in Concord, Massachusetts. A Unitarian minister in his youth, Emerson left the clergy in 1832 to devote himself to writing, teaching, and lecturing. In Nature, Emerson wrote, "The quest for self-fulfillment, individuals should work for a communion with the natural world. In the woods, in return to reason and faith, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the bath of air and uplifted into an infinite space, all egotism vanished. I am part and particle of God." In other essays, he would be even more explicit of advocating his commitment to individual fulfillment. Thoreau's Walden, Henry David Thoreau, he was a self-realization, resisted pressures to conform to society's responsibilities and expectations. Thoreau's own effort, immortalized in Walden in 1854, led him to build a small cabin in the Concord Woods on Walden's Pond, where he lived alone for 2 years, as simply as he could, attempting to liberate himself from what he considered society's excesses. In 1849, the essay Renaissance to a Civil Government, he extended his critique of artificial constraints in society and government, arguing that government required an individual to violate his or her own morality, and it had no legitimate authority. The proper response was civil disobedience or passive resistance. Public refused to obey the unjust laws. Defense of nature. Emerson and Thoreau talked about nature and suggested the small influences groups had on other things, mountains, everything made from a painter, everything that was there, that we should be so blessed with what we have. The roots of the environment. Genuinely spiritual, they argued they did not come from formal religion, but communion with the natural world. And then you have the utopia, okay? And there's Brooks Farm, and there's New Harmony. In 1841, George Ripley, Brooks Farm was established, and he was a Boston transcendentalist. The experimental community was in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, where, according to Ripley, individuals would rather create a new society that permitted every member to have full opportunity for self-realization. All residents would share equally in labor of community, and all could share as well as leisure, in which essential for cultivation of self. The tension between the ideal individual freedom and demands of the communal society, however, eventually took its toll on Farmbrook. Many residents became disenchanted and left. When fire destroyed the central building of the community in 1847, the experiment dissolved. And so they talked about this, on how this utopia was supposed to work. And, you know, we get a series of books from Nathan Hathorne, the Violетdale Romance, Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables, and he wrote passionately about what was happening and the misery of people. Okay, and then New Harmony comes in. And this is the plan. Brooks was the only one of the experiments that year before the Civil War. The Scottish industrialist Robert Owen founded an experimental community in Indiana in 1825 and named it New Harmony. It was to be a village cooperation in which every resident worked and lived in total equality. The community was an economic failure, but the vision had inspired continual enchantment by some Americans. The Owenites' experiments were established in other locations in ensuing years. And here's the deal. They want this community to be so wonderful that if we take everything out and we make everybody equal, that it's going to work. The problem is, it doesn't usually work. People always want to one-up somebody. Redefining gender roles. Many of the utopian communities were deeply concerned with the relationship between men and women. Most enduring establishment was the Oneida community, established in 1848 in New York by John Humphreys Noyes. The Oneida Perfectionists, as residents in the community called themselves, rejected traditional notions of family and marriage. All residents were married to all other residents. There was no permanent conjugal ties. But Oneida was not. As horrified critics often claimed, the experiment was unrestrained free love. It was placed in the community with carefully monitored sexual behavior, where women protected themselves from unwanted childbearing, where children were raised in communal, often seeing little of their own parents. Oneida took pride in what they considered their liberation of women from the demands of male lust. The Shakers, too, redefined traditional gender roles founded by Mother Ann Lee. In 1770, the Society of the Shakers survived through the 20th century. The Shakers attracted particularly large following. Century established more than 20 communities through the Northeast and Northwest in the 1840s. They derived their name for their unique religious rituals, which the congregation would shake themselves free of sin while performing large chants and dances. Shakerism attracted about 6,000 members in 1840. More women than men lived in communals contracted between men and women who were strictly limited. They endorsed the idea of sexual equality, though women exercised greater power. The Mormons. There is a very good PBS document on the Mormons to see the whole thing. So Joseph Smith creates the he begins the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints. Mormons began in upstate New York through the efforts of Joseph Smith. In 1830, he was just 24. He published a remarkable document, the Book of Mormon, and named the ancient prophet who he claimed had written it. It was, he said, the translation of a set of gold tablets that he found in the hills of New York, revealed to him by Morin, an angel of God. The Book of Mormon told the story of two ancient civilizations in America whose people had anticipating the coming of Christ and were worried when Jesus actually came to America after his resurrection. Both civilizations collapsed because of their rejection of Christian principles, but Smith believed the history of righteous society would serve the model for building a new holy community in the United States. He started gathering more groups, and for his new community of saints, with later efforts continue unhappily for more than 15 years. Time and time again, the Latter-day Saints, as they called themselves, attempted to establish peaceful communities, and time again they were met with persecution in the neighborhoods. Claims of the new prophet, new scriptures, and divine authority made differences for them near the end of his life. So Joseph Smith is this Mormon, and he has these revelations that come to him, and he starts traveling. They were driven from their original settlements in Missouri, Kirkland, Ohio, and then they found a town in Illinois, and they named it Novato. And when he is there, Joseph Smith has the revelation that he needs to have multiple wives. Plural marriage is what it needed to be. So this was not in the original doctrine of the original Mormon Book of Mormon. It's a revelation for him. Joseph Smith published an inflammatory attack on him, his enemies did, and he was arrested, imprisoned near Carthage. There was an angry mob that attacked the jail and fatally shot Joseph Smith. Mormons soon abandoned, and the leadership of successors was Brigham Young. And Brigham Young traveled with 12,000 strong, one of the largest single groups of migration in American history, across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, and established the city of Salt Lake City. Several communities in Utah, including the present-day Salt Lake City, were finally where Mormons were able to create a long-lasting settlement. Now, Brigham Young, he ended up, he wasn't fond of the idea of plural marriage, and then he decided that he was going to, after Joseph Smith dies, that he needs to take that on. And he has 55 wives. Now, if you look at the research of Brigham Young, of those 55 wives, a lot of them were widows before, and then he does end up having 67 children, and that. So there are still descendants of Joseph Smith today. Reform efforts. The impulse to create new movements and remake mainstream society women for both rank and file of leadership comes in. And then we have the religious basis of reform, where we're looking at this enlightened society that is the temperance movement that comes in and argues that more responsibility of crime, disorder, and poverty because of excessive alcohol. Women complained that men spent their money and family needed alcohol, and the drunken husbands often beat and abused their wives. Temperance also appealed to those who were alarmed by immigration, drunkenness. Many nativism believed the response for violence and disorder of immigrant communities. By 1840, the temperance had become a major national movement and a powerful organization. Cholera epidemic. A severe bacterial infection of the intestines, usually corrected from contaminated food or water, and many people died. Nearly a quarter of the population of New Orleans in 1833 perished from the disease. Many cities established health boards to try to find and prevent the epidemic, but medical professionals of the time had not yet realized the nature of bacteria and had no answers. So, phrenology. Instead, Americans turned to non-scientific theories improving health. Men and women flocked to health spas for water cures, hydrotherapy, and produced healthier through immersing people in hot and cold baths and wrapping them in wet sheets. Other people adopted new dietary theories. Sylvester Graham, of Connecticut-born Presbyterian minister, committed reform, won many followers in his prescription of eating fruits, vegetables, bread made from coarsely ground flour, prescription not unlike some diets theories today, and avoiding meat. The graham cracker is made from that kind of flour and is named for him. Perhaps the strongest of all modern senses was the widespread belief of science, came to popularized in the 1830s by the Fowler brothers. And the phrenologist argued that the shape of an individual's skull was an important indicator of his or her character and intelligence, made an elaborate measurement of bumps, indentation, and calculated size, the different areas of the brain. Phrenology seems to provide a way of measuring individual fitness for various positions of life and promised to end the arbitrary process of people matching their talents to occupations and responsibilities. The theory is now universally believed to have no scientific value at all. Medical science. During this age, you have people that are really scared of the medical techniques. People are poorly educated, and they think there's a lot of quacks out there. I'm going to go back, sorry. The biggest problem facing American medicine, however, was the absence of basic knowledge about disease. Great American achievements in the 18th century developed the vaccine of smallpox by Jenner, who came a broad theory of brilliant adaptation of folk practices of the country. William Morton, who was looking for ways to help patients endure extraction of teeth. Beginning in 1844, Morton began to experiment with sulfur. John Warren of Boston, surgeon, soon began using sedated surgical patients. The evidence with men that met with stiff resistance and traditional physicians who mistrusted the evolution. And then the germ theory. Oliver Wendell Holmes published a large number of cases of peculiar fever, concluded that the disease could be transmitted from one person to another, and discovered that the contagions met with a storm of criticisms later in clinical success. Hungarian physician Sweetwells would notice the infection seems to spread by medical students who had been working on a diseased corpse. Once they began requiring students to wash their hands and disinfect their instruments, the infections virtually disappeared. Thank God we have that. Because once you start washing your hands, and that's why we're so keen on washing your hands, washing your hands, washing your hands. Horseman led reforms in public school. Horace Mann was the first Secretary of Massachusetts Board of Education, established in 1837. Mann and his followers, education was the only way to preserve democracy, essential working for free political system. Mann recognized Massachusetts' school system, lengthened the school year to 6 months, doubled teacher salaries, broadened curriculum, and introduced new methods of professional teaching for teachers. Other states followed, building new schools, creating teacher colleges, and offering many children access to education for the first time, and supported a tax elementary school established in every state. Uneven public education. Many children had no access to schools at all. In the South, all Africans were barred from education. About a third of all white children in school age were actually enrolled in schools in 1860. 72% were enrolled, but even there, many students attended class only briefly or casually. Scoring literacy rates. Despite the limitations and inequalities, achievement in school reform were impressive. By the beginning of the Civil War, the United States had one of the highest literacy rates in the nation. 94% of the population of the North and 83% of the white population in the South were literate. Rehabilitation. Dorothea Knox. Beginning in 1820, many states built new penitentiaries and mental asylums. New York built the first penitentiary in Auburn in 1821. In Massachusetts, the reformer Dorothea Dix began a national movement for methods of treating individuals with mental illness. New forms of prison discipline were designed to reform and rehabilitate criminals. Solitary confinement, imposing a sentence on a work crew. Both were meant to give prisoners opportunity to meditate on their wrongdoing and develop a penance, hence penitentiary. Reserving concept born. Some of the same impulses produced asylums underlined the emergence of the new reform approach to the problem with Native Americans and the ideas of reservations. For several decades, dominant thrust of the United States towards a policy of Indians had been relocation, getting the tribes out of the way of the white civilization. Among some whites, there's also been another intent to move Indians to a place where they would be allowed to develop to a point which assimilation might be possible. It was small steps. The great work of regenerating the Indian race. Declaration of Sentiments and Resolution. Declaration of Sentiments and Rights comes in on which all men and women are created equal. The women are no less than men endowed with certain inalienable rights. And they sourced it from the Declaration of Independence that gave women the rights. So in Seneca Falls, New York in 1847, they organized a convention to discuss the rights of women, demanding the right to vote, launching movements for women's suffrage that would survive until the battle was finally won in 1920. Feminist secondary status. This becomes a problem. For women, they felt that they had no control, and their demands were a secondary position which may consider far greater issue than the rights of slaves. The crusade against slavery. Oh, let's go back. The other problem was you have the struggle of blacks. Of course, many blacks had no rights at all, and we're still in the time where blacks, this is before the Civil War, most blacks do not have rights. Even in other free areas, they're still treated differently. Jordan Lee Jaretta Lee, born free in 1783 in Cape May, New Jersey, as a 21-year-old woman living in Philadelphia, she preached in public schools and earned an invitation to Reverend Richard Allen to speak at his church. Yet other ministers welcomed her, which Lee struggled to understand. She argued in 1833, if a man was to preach because the Savior died for him, why not a woman, seeing that he died for her also, not the whole Savior. And then Rebecca Cox Jackson, growing up a free woman in Philadelphia during the 1800s, she lived much of her life with her brother, Joseph Cox, an African Methodist Episcopal minister. Followed instructions he gave her by the Heavenly Spirit, Jackson began to host prayer meetings and quickly surged in popularity. And men and women worshiped side by side in the Methodist Church. In 1833, Jackson embarked on preaching and touring outside of Philadelphia, met with a new and greater resistance. Her existence in her right to preach, open refusal to join a church, radical views on sexuality, which includes celibacy within the marriage, angered many circles. Jackson claimed motivated some to assault her. And she returned to Philadelphia, founded the Shaker community, composed mainly of black women. Crusade against slavery. There was early opposition to slavery. In the 19th century, those opposed and were more part of the calm Gentile lot. And of course, we know that we can't become a nation if we don't allow slavery in the southern states. We knew it was going to be a thing. And so we have some holdups here. The United States to the west coast of Africa, there was 1830 established the nation of Liberia. Liberia became an independent black republic with its capital Monrovia, became named for American president who had presided over the initial settlement. William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison's philosophy was so simple that it was uniquely revolutionary. Opponents to slavery, he said, should not talk about the evil influence slaveries on the white society, but rather the damage the system did to slaves. They should therefore reject gradualism and the demands of immediate abolition of slavery and extend all rights to American citizens to both slaves and free African Americans. Garrison wrote, relentless, uncompromising tone. I'm aware, he wrote for the first issue of The Liberator, and may object to the serenity of my language, but there is not cause for severity. It will be harsh truth, uncompromising justice. I am earnest. I will not advocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat from a single inch. I will be heard. He cracked at a large group of followers in the North, enough to have him founded a New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1832, and a year later, after the Convention of Philadelphia, an Anti-Slavery Society. Garrison's revolutionary philosophy was that this is what it had to be. We had to move out. We had to push the envelope against slavery. Frederick Douglass. He is probably one of my favorites of this time. Frederick Douglass was born a slave. He was taught by one of his first master's wives how to read and write. And when the master found out about it, then he was sold to another family. He meets his first wife, who was a free black woman, and he says he can't marry her unless he's free. He runs away. They end up getting married, and he starts talking about abolitioning and that. Things happen. He ends up going to Europe and talking on the platform about ending slavery. He has earned enough money by that point to buy his freedom from the master. He moves back to the United States from being abroad with and his wife stayed in America during that time, and they had kids together. And his house could see the Capitol building, the White House. He bought his house on land that was only white Protestants could buy. He had a middleman go and buy it, and he bought the house on the hill, which is really cool. His wife and him had separate bedrooms for that time. His wife died, and 7 or 10 years after his wife died, he married his white assistant, who became his second wife, who preserved all the rest of his things. He's a remarkable man. There's lots of history on him that is so amazing. And he really worked for getting the betterment of the blacks, and he believed that you needed to agitate and not give up. It was not, okay, we won this freedom, we have to keep going and keep going and keep going. Violent reprisals. As a result of fears and escalating wave of violence, a mob in Philadelphia attacked the abolitionist headquarters in 1843, burned it to the ground, and began a bloody riot. Another mob seized the garrison on the streets of Boston in 1835 and threatened to hang him. He was saved from death only by being locked in jail. Lovejoy, the editor of the abolitionist newspaper of Illinois, was the victim of repeated and finally killed when he tried to defend the printing of the press. That so many men and women continue to embrace abolitionists in the face of such vicious opposition, they suggest that abolitionists was not the people who took their political commitment lightly. They were very strong-willed, passionate crusaders about this courageous endeavor. Radicals and moderates. We start seeing a divide. You have William Lloyd Garrison, who shocked even many of his own, including Frederick Douglass, by attacking not only slavery but the government itself. The Constitution, he said, was a covenant with death and the agreement with hell. In 1840, Garrison, a formal division within American anti-slavery society by insisting that women be permitted to participate in the movement on the terms of full equality. He continued after 1840 to arouse controversy with the new and even more radical stance. An extreme pacifism he rejected, even defended wars, opposition to all former coercion, not just slavery, prisons, asylums, and finally in 1843 a call for northern disillusionment from the South. The Amistad case, that's a great movie if you haven't seen it, and it's a legal battle over a Spanish slave vessel, the Amistad. After the Supreme Court, Briggs versus Pennsylvania in 1842, ruled that the state need not aid for enforcing a 1793 law requiring the return of fugitive slaves to their owner. Abolitionists won passage of several northern states' personal liberty laws, which forbade state officials to assist in capturing and returning runaways. The Anti-Slavery Society also petitioned Congress to abolish slavery in places where federal government had jurisdiction, in territories and in the District of Columbia, and to no profit of interstate trade. Anti-slavery sentiments underlined forbade in 1840 the Liberty Party, which ran in Kentucky for slavery under James Birney for president, and the Free Soil. The Amistad case is one of those cases that because of it, they were able to send them back. And it's one of those true issues with slavery. Then Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the novel, published in 1852. It sold more than 300,000 copies within the year of publication, was reissued again and again. It succeeds to bring a message of abolitionists, an enormous new audience, not only to those that read the book, but also those who watch the countless theater companies reenacted across the nation. It is the little women who made the greater war. Revived in the South, Stowe became a hero for many of the North, and both religion and her novels helped inflame the sensational tension of the new level of passion. So abolishing slavery becomes what they want. It becomes the divide that is happening between the North and the South. And that's where we're heading with this, that we're changing on the behalf. There's something going to happen. It's going to change the greater world.